It's Tuesday the 6th of March. You're listening to Breakfast with Julia Hartley-Brewer. Coming up, a former Russian double agent is critically ill in hospital following his suspected exposure to an unknown substance. Up next, former chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Tory MP Crispin Blunt on that. Also, Britain needs to go on a diet. Yes, all of us. That's according to Public Health England. They want fast food outlets, supermarkets, restaurants and food manufacturers to cut calories in their products by 20% to help tackle the childhood obesity problem. More on that in just 15 minutes' time. Plus, find out before 9 how many adults would rather share a bed with their pet than their partner. Yes, really. I think it's to do with snoring and stealing the duvet. And how well do you know your neighbours? A new poll says that 4 in 5 of us couldn't put them out in a police lineup. If you do know your neighbours, do you actually like them? I want your stories of neighbourly friendships, but more importantly, let's hear about those arguments over the garden fence as well. Tweet me at talkRADIO. Do you love or loathe your neighbours? The time is 6 minutes past 8 o'clock. This is talkRADIO.
The No Nonsense Breakfast with Julia Hartley-Brewer on talkRADIO. We'll get you talking.
Lots of tweets are coming in on your neighbours. As I've had the worst neighbours. I mean, we've lawyered up worst neighbours and the best neighbours. So it can go either way. And I tell you what, the difference it makes to your home if you've got good neighbours or bad neighbours. Love to hear your stories. Do tweet me at talkRADIO. We'll get to as many of those as possible. Joining me all morning, Andre Walker, columnist for the New York Observer, and Brendan Chilton, General Secretary of Labour Leave. I say all morning. We'll allow you. We'll unlock the studio door at 9 o'clock. We'll let you leave then. Coming up later in this hour, we are going to be talking more about this cutting our calorie count, according to Public Health England, and the big thaw leading thousands of people across the country without water, and this extraordinary poll about people rather share their bed with their pet than their partner. It says a lot about some people's marriages. First up, though, the story that has been leading all the news stories since 6 o'clock last night when it first broke is that this Russian spy who's suspected of being poisoned. Sergei Skripal and a young female companion were found basically unconscious on a bench in a shopping centre in Salisbury in Wiltshire. He was a former colonel in the FSB. That's, of course, they basically moved on from the KGB to the FSB. He was a former Russian intelligence agent. However, in 2006, he was sentenced by the Russians to 13 years behind bars for high treason. He had been working for MI6. Well, in 2010, just 4 years later, he was part of a key spy swap. You remember Anna Chapman, a very glamorous Russian sleeper agent in America. She was actually, though, a British British citizenship. She was one of those for whom he was swapped. He came to live here in Britain. Hasn't been really heard of since. But was this possibly another act of state-sponsored terrorism by the Putin authorities? Bearing in mind it has a lot of echoes of what happened to Alexander Litvinenko, the former Russian agent who was poisoned to death with polonium-210 back in 2006. A public inquiry, of course, later found that he probably had been murdered on the direct orders of Vladimir Putin. Well, Sergei Skripal and his female companion remain in critical condition, intensive care in Salisbury in Wiltshire. But what happens next? Well, let's talk to Crispin Blunt, who's Conservative MP for Reigate. He's also former chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee and joins us now. Good morning to you, Crispin.
Good morning.
These, obviously, the echoes of the Alexander Litvinenko affair are what, of course, are gripping the nation today. A major incident was declared with the fears of poisoning. As yet, certainly in the public domain, there is no knowledge of what was used, or we don't know for sure if he was actually poisoned. But obviously the concerns are there. If it does prove to be the case that he has been poisoned in a similar manner to Litvinenko, what happens next?
Well, it's very difficult. We know we're dealing with a Russian government that has a history of murdering its opponents abroad, and you've got the evidence of President Putin, I think back in 2010 on television, or was it 2006? I can't remember the exact time, but it was broadcast last night, of making a clear and explicit threat to opponents of the regime, and where Sergei Skripal would fall wholly into that category.
Well, indeed. And yet the fact that there was this spy swap would suggest, that this is over and done with. Certainly the former counter-terrorism expert we spoke to earlier in the show was saying that the normal form is, once there is a spy swap, those people are sort of, for want of a better phrase, out of bounds. They're out of circulation, and they are basically protected by the country to whom they've been returned. But this would suggest that's not the case. But there has been some suggestions in the media reports today that Sergei Skripal had continued to work for MI6.
Well, who knows? I certainly don't, and I don't imagine MI6 will be broadcasting
Exactly.
agent list anytime soon. At least I certainly hope not. But the fact that the Russians appear to continue to go after people after you've had swaps like this, which is what that appears to be the evidence, and all the rather long list of suspicious deaths of Russians in the United Kingdom, suggests that we're not dealing with a power that believes in reciprocity, where the point would have been made by your previous interviewee that the swap happened and that would be the end of the matter. It doesn't appear to be the end of the matter as far as the Russians are concerned, and I don't imagine we're rushing around Russia trying to kill people who of our former citizens who then ended up in the employ of the Russians.
No, well, the Britain's top counter-terrorism officer, that's the Metropolitan Police Assistant Commissioner Mark Rowley, said that his specialists are supporting this police investigation. He said this morning, clearly it's a very unusual case. The critical thing is to get to the bottom of what has caused this incident as quickly as possible. They are basically, the counter-terrorism network is coordinating across the country. He did also add that there are deaths which attract attention. He said, I think we have to remember that Russian exiles are not immortal. They do all die, and there can be a tendency for some conspiracy theories. But likewise, he added, we have to be alive to the fact of state threats as illustrated by the Litvinenko case. And this is the thing, isn't it? It may feel like it's a little bit of a sort of a spy thriller novel or a Hollywood film. But given what's happened in the past, Georgy Markov, the poisoned umbrella with Litvinenko, just in very recent past, in only 2006, we are alive to this concern. But there's a lot of concern about the total failure to, I suppose, bring anyone to justice after Alexander Litvinenko's murder. But also the failure of the British authorities to stand up to the Russians, this feeling that, well, there's not much we can do about it. Is there anything we can do about it? Because if we are talking about another case of state-sponsored murder on the streets of Britain by a foreign government, this is a very serious issue. Crispin, are you there? Oh, we just seem to have lost Crispin's line. We'll get him back up on the line. And in the meantime, let's talk to Brendan Chilton, who's General Secretary of Labour Leave, who joins me in the studio. Brendan, lots of concerns that we've been talking about all morning about this this possible assassination. Again, we don't know all the facts yet, as Crispin Blunt was pointing out, but there are serious implications here, aren't there?
There are indeed, and I certainly think one of the things we really need to consider as well, looking at all this, is the impact on the local community itself. It's not really been brought up at all. I mean, there are probably a lot of people in Salisbury this morning very worried, especially those that were in that restaurant or in the immediate vicinity. And if the Russians, or if it turns out to be the Russians, are going to continue to engage in this, we need to perhaps look at our relationship with them and, I don't know, perhaps expel diplomats or something, whatever we do.
That's what we end up doing, isn't it? Crispin Blunt, I'm delighted you're back on the line, say former chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. Sorry about that. It's interesting what Brendan Chilton was just saying from Labour Leave, that what actions do we end up taking in response to these sorts of crises?
Well, there was quite a reasonable gradated response to the apparent murder of Litvinenko in 2006-07. This is before Judge Owen held Putin in effect responsible, but certainly and identified the murderers. At that time, the relationship between the security services and our intelligence agencies was switched off. So cooperation, there was in that sense, I think a properly calibrated response. The difficulty is that Russian behavior hasn't stopped since then. And if it turns out that this guy has been poisoned in a way that others have been poisoned, then it's our political relations are already in the deep freeze with Russia. It's quite difficult to see what further steps one can take unless one then starts going very hard on economic sanctions, which of course at the moment we have to do within the European Union.
But as we know, within the European Union, even after they walked into Ukraine, countries like Germany and France were very wary of strict sanctions because, of course, they get gas supplies from Russia.
And the United Kingdom was at the very hawkish end of a measure that ought to be taken against Russia. So it just poses real difficulties for us, but a response there needs to be this. But if it turns out this is another Russian state assassination, then we are going to have to find some form of appropriate response. But our relations are so bad, it's quite difficult to see exactly how they can get significantly worse.
But there are so many concerns, not only with Russia, what they've did in Ukraine, what they're doing in Syria right now, and even, both absolutely supporting Assad regime while they're happily bombing, aid convoys into Syria when there's supposed to be a UN-sanctioned peace convoy. We know, there are conscriptions being reintroduced in the Baltic states because they're so concerned about incursions from Russian troops. There is no doubt at all that Vladimir Putin is flexing his muscles on the world stage, and that the West is standing by and shrugging. I mean, the answer, the response to all of his actions has been a collective international shrug. And the message that's gone to him, whether it's, assassinations of citizens on British streets or in international incursions, is that nothing, there is no penalty for this other than some economic sanctions. Surely the message is going out to Vladimir Putin that he can continue to act with impunity.
Well, it's very difficult when nations choose to step outside the norms of international relations and assassinating people, and even if they were formerly your citizens but are no longer in other countries, are certainly doing that, and all the other actions you described on international affairs. And then also got the challenge of the strategic management of Russia. This is a country with a declining population in relative economic decline against its neighbors. Actually, its strategic problem is not the West. Its strategic long-term problem is China. And if the Russians had a proper view of their long-term interests, they, I think, would be trying to significantly warm up the relations with Europe and North America in order to have them as allies against their biggest and growing long-term strategic partner, China.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Crispin Blunt is former chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Conservative MP. Let me bring in Andre Walker, columnist of the New York Observer, on this. He's been joining me in the studio. Look, there are lots of concerns about this, but let's take this wider. You've been a fan of Donald Trump. Donald Trump has basically said that Vladimir Putin is his friend. Nothing that Vladimir Putin has done since Donald Trump has been in office suggests that he is. If there's one person we know who's not going to act on anything that Vladimir Putin does, whether it's poisoning people on the streets, and again that's yet unproven, whether it's in Syria or anywhere else, it is Donald Trump, because he's failed to even enforce Congress-sanctioned economic sanctions.
Yeah, I think it's worth bearing in mind with Donald Trump that Donald Trump believes in negotiating with everybody, and therefore saying Vladimir Putin is my friend. Well, no, he even suggests at one point he'd be willing to meet Kim Jong-un. So, I mean, he's willing to sort of talk to anybody, and I think he is also willing to flex muscle at appropriate moments, simply because I think Donald Trump thought when he came into the White House that the whole world was going to change. Suddenly, the master negotiator was going to make everything different, and I think we're seeing now really that patterns that have always existed continue to exist. I have to say, though, about Crispin Blunt, and I'm not being critical of him for one second, the job of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee is to scrutinise British policy, not to make it. But, he was clearly at a loss as to what to do about this. And what he laid out after the death of Alexander Litvinenko had clearly completely failed. Because by definition, if we discover the Russians have poisoned this guy, then it proves that whatever we did last time about the last poisoning didn't have any traction at all.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much indeed for that. Coming up, we're going to be talking about why Public Health England want us all to cut our calorie intake. We're all going on a diet, Britain. The time is 8:19. This is Talk Radio.
Talk Radio.
Join the Talk Nation.
Dial up and talk radio.